So I interrupted my Halloween reading plans, setting aside books like The Familiar or The House at Watch Hill in favor of Expediting Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner because it was due back at the library and had an extensive hold list. And yes, after filming this video, it will immediately be going back to the library. However, in hindsight, I do fear that that choice was ultimately a mistake. The good news is, while I personally didn't find this book ultimately successful, I do think that there were a lot of interesting things it was doing and attempting that we can dig into for a Feature Friday, which is what we are going to do now. Hi, my name is Melody, if you haven't been here before, or if you haven't been here before when I've actually introduced myself, because I'm not great at it, and we talk about books and book-adjacent things on this channel. Very happy to have you here, whether you are new or returning, and would love for you to consider hanging out more. Ideally, every Friday we are digging in, reviewing, discussing a book. I have been a little bad about that this year, so we're getting back into the groove. And with that, let's jump into Creation Lake, which was longlisted for the Booker this year. And I think that there's a lot to unpack there in relation to how the book works. And I do think that ultimately its voice, its form, its perspective were what got it on that list because it was attempting things, or doing novel things in terms of form. But as a reader, I don't know that that worked for me. So this book is about Sadie, the name we as readers know her by. We never get her actual name, who is a private sector spy infiltrating a commune. That's basically the gist, the setup, the premise of this book. And so it appears on its face very thriller, very action-focused, while also still being a literary bend of that. Now, I think the balance of that is part of the discussion in relation to this book, because on some level, I do fear, or think that this book feared, being too action forward. And the idea of action in terms of like the way we define action in relation to something like a thriller or a political thriller not being as literary because of those genre associations. And I don't know that the way this book approached that ultimately served what I think it was exploring, but at the same time, I do think the book opens a lot of questions that it is clearly exploring and leaves us with a lot of open-ended considerations. And I do think the open-endedness of that is purposeful. It's purposeful in the sense that if they had intended, or if Kushner had intended to give us answers, we would have them. But this at its heart is an intense character study, and that character work is also where the novel, I think, really excels. And I think that that perspective and voice and point of view in particular is what got it on the long list for the Booker, because we are seeing everything through Sadie's point of view. And like I said, she is a disgraced, actually, private sector spy. She's private sector because she has been or was disgraced. Her cover was blown in the public sector, and her cover was blown in the sense that she infiltrated a group and coerced them into making the decisions that led to their prosecution. And that opens a lot of questions and conversations about the nature of intel and spying in groups domestically, because she was originally from the US. This book is set in France, and so it's looking at a lot of these movements more globally, which I do think is really interesting, especially in the current political environment. In some ways, it kind of harkened back for me as a reader to Birnam Wood in terms of its considerations. We end up on a commune. They're ultimately very different and have different purposes, but this idea of going back to nature in whatever way is kind of central to both, though the perspectives of both are vastly different. We're looking at the inner workings of a commune in both, but this feels a lot more traditional in terms of its critique of how power structures usually fall out in these groups, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, because ultimately the book gets into it a little bit more later. And I think that that was one of my main critiques, because the voice is incredibly smart. Kushner is a very intelligent writer. I have not encountered her work since The Mars Room, which I read on audio the year it came out. It was like, I want to say 2019. I remember it was the year I was reading a lot on audio because I was working in a basement, I was stacking papers, I had a lot of mental energy to give to audiobooks, let's put it that way, which was great. And it was a great escape, but I don't fully remember that book, which is saying something because there are a lot of audiobooks I read that year that I remember very viscerally. And so I think it was just very middle of the road for me personally as a reading experience, but I remember it being very hyped. Here, I don't have a real sense of the hype of this book. I just have a sense of my reading experience, and there were things I really, really enjoyed about this, while also starting to feel like it was a bit of a slog after that halfway point. And it's interesting because, like I said, to kind of return to this idea of the voice, it was incredibly readable while still being very smart. It was propulsive in the sense that the chapters and the sections were very short, while action and the propulsion of the narrative were actually taking a back seat. It was much more theological, philosophical. Philosophical is the word I want. And that is evident from the first page because we don't open with action. We open with some emails that Sadie has hacked into from one of the mentors of this commune. And it's kind of a philosophical ramble about Neanderthals. And we will return to both the Neanderthals of it all and this idea of the origins of us as humans and as a species and what progress has wrought on the world, which I think are things that are probably going to be even more topical than they were when I read this book, though still very topical, clearly. But at the same time, these considerations are always very indulgent. And I think the contrast of them being indulgent and the philosophizing of it made me think a lot of transcendentalism. And maybe that's just because I don't know about your school system, but my AP 11th grade English class spent a lot of time on transcendentalism, and that was like our big paper that kind of broke all of us just a little bit because our teacher wanted us to find something, take three separate, disparate transcendentalist thinkers and have them agree on something. I think I wrote about education. That would track for me. And the joke of it for him was that transcendentalists didn't really agree on things. But what I was kind of circling to in this thought was the privilege inherent in transcendentalism. We talk a lot about this idea of like the man that goes and lives in a cabin in the woods, but has the support of women in the background actually propping up his ability to live that secluded lifestyle and what that means, and the privilege inherent in that, as well as the way that that privilege informs the thought. And I do think that that was a central idea of this book, especially as we got to the commune itself, halfway-ish, maybe even over halfway-ish through the book. But so much of the book is broken up by these emails, these thought exercises, and I don't know that they were really ultimately compelling enough for me as a reader to keep me going, to keep me pushing. After a while, I started to stall in them rather than to be intrigued into what they were setting up, because I had read, or my interpretation of the copy of the jacket was that Sadie, our protagonist, was going to end up kind of taken in by this group and this thought, this idea that this woman who believes inherently that she is the smartest person in the room is kind of bamboozled in some ways, and this idea of cultish thinking and how none of us are immune to being enthralled by cultish thinking on some level, going back to the book, of course, Cultish. And while she does become enthralled of these emails because we have to keep reading them with her, I don't know that that is ultimately, I feel like that interpretation is a little bit more active when it feels like the book is a lot more passive, or Sadie even feels a lot more passive, even as she is directly impacting and manipulating the action of this commune. The book itself feels like we are taking an outside look on it, and it's not the kind of outside look where I feel necessarily like I get that fuzzy brain, but it is something where we are intellectualizing it a lot more, which could be a commentary as well, right? Because this group is intellectualizing it. And Sadie, again, believes she's the smartest person. And so she, on some level, is intellectualizing things. And what is the payoff of that? What is the result of all of that? I also kept going back to Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You? Yes, I still need to read Intermezzo. But the philosophical breaks in that book read much more as informing character to me, and while it is obviously a stiller, more philosophical book as well, I think the way it achieves that, or how it's achieving that, is ultimately much different. However, to go back to Sadie a little bit, or the person known as Sadie, I do think that seeing this world through her eyes, because we are in her perspective outside of these emails, is the most interesting thing about this narrative. It is in first person, and it's a narrator we can't necessarily trust because we have this history of her sprinkled throughout of doing things that I personally would consider unethical, and asking us as readers inevitably to sympathize with her fears of that past coming back to bite her. Even as she is trying to present herself as above that past or beyond that past, she still has Google alerts set for it. And she's also drinking a lot in this narrative that is both indicative, I think, of those fears, and also is another layer of distrust for her as a narrator in relation to that. And I think that distrust, combined, of course, with her being a more flawed, unlikable narrator, are very interesting because we are forced to be seeing this from her perspective. And so we have to be questioning her. And at the same time, I'm questioning this commune. And amidst all of this, she has set up camp in this crumbling countryside family estate of this man that she particularly sought out, both for this location and for his connections with one of the leaders of this commune, this counter movement, however we want to think about it. And this is both incredibly symbolic, and the way she interacts with that space and what it says about her as a character. Details like her drinking from every glass and not washing them because this is not her place, and like making a mess in a room, and when it's too big a mess, she just closes the door and moves to a different part of the house because she will not be staying here. And I think that's really interesting because it's so revelatory of character within the action, but it's also incredibly symbolic to her character and state of mind. And so I think on some level, details like that ultimately led to things like the Booker nomination as well, which I'm not begrudging. I'm just kind of unpacking where I had less of a connection than I thought I was going to, based on this kind of being lauded in some way. And so then this puts her in the proximity of this commune, of this group, and she has been engaged by these silent employers to essentially bring them down or use them to instigate a specific political movement or moment that will serve this nameless group of power. However, I think that the real interest to me was within the dynamics of this commune, which from the first entry, we have a narrator who is questioning for herself and kind of needling a little question to the leader, who she has particularly pinpointed, that upholds these patriarchal systems of power as we think of them, even as it's presenting itself as a revolutionary space. And so this disconnect and cognitive dissonance between seeing yourself in this revolutionary movement and moment while upholding these traditional power structures, and the way that these power structures really end up playing in to all movements, and how the leader of this group, or the one who's looked to as the leader, comes from power and money traditionally, and how that transposes into the group, how it offers him protection, how it allows him within this group to operate as a thought leader rather than a laborer, and also to have this acclaim for women to seek him out, and just the privilege that translates. It's also interesting because we have so many of these writings from these mentors. This group has two kind of contrasting mentors and thought leaders that are feeding in to what is going on. And yet, I personally never felt like they had a distinct purpose. They were very ecologically based, and this idea of kind of turning back the wheels of modernity in the sense of pushing back against the ways our natural resources are being corrupted by forward momentum, choices being made. I don't have all of the words, but I think we have, the pictures of what that looks like. And so our narrator has come into this space under the guise of helping translate their works, their books, to English in order to disseminate these ideas. And this offers her a seat at the table with these thought leaders of this group, which ultimately end up being only men, at the same time that we have this extra layer of her having this superiority of being the one kind of pulling the strings and manipulating them, and her sense of being outside of this. So she doesn't really care. She seeks to really forward her own personal desires where those may fall, while also, getting the job done, whatever that may mean. And yet at the same time, we do watch as this place ultimately changes her. And so she really returns again and again to the thoughts of Bruno, one of these mentors, these thought leaders, the man whose email she's hacked into, who is much, like I said, more of a passive presence than I thought. So Sadie is really the one seeking out this thought at the end of the day. She is not necessarily being manipulated by someone in person. And in some ways, this is interesting to me because I have become fascinated over the last decade-ish. This is going to be a shocker, I know, about the idea of cultish thinking permeating over digital spaces and the ways that we manipulate truth and thought online, where in theory we should have more of a distance from the power of persuasion and the cult of personality of these types of figures, and should in theory have more of a delineation because there should be less of the ability to do things like manipulate time and ability to sleep and that sense of urgency in that way. And so in some ways, her combing through these emails feels like it is engaging with that idea, even as it doesn't feel like it really truly grapples with it. And maybe it's just that I found his thoughts so kind of uninteresting at the end of the day. It feels incredibly indulgent. And I think it is. I think that's part of the commentary, this idea that it is indulgent to be able to go off by yourself and do this. And even the kind of exploration of, again, what community looks like and is, and what a community that can actually foment change looks like. And is this community actually interested in fomenting change? And this is illustrated by some of the kind of hangers-on that aren't being allowed into the group, who have been part of other revolutionary movements and have come here thinking that they're going to help make some kind of change in this group and aren't being allowed in, as well as discontented former members of this group who have been kicked out, and just some of the critiques that are inherent there. And so there is that sense of unease through that, even as we are kept somewhat at a distance of the immediacy of the mission, because again, we are seeing this through Sadie's point of view. And so we have the luxury of that intellectualization as well, because if we were looking at this through the perspective of one of the everyday members of this group, I think that there would be a lot more moral urgency behind things. And so I think that is why the point of view of this book is really its shining star, because it is doing something so interesting within that point of view. And I think that that has really been something for me to think about, because this year we've had a lot of discussion, or at least some discussion, about point of view. And we've had a lot of readers kind of expressing an interest or a preference for first-person point of view. And this is generally, or has generally been, within the romance genre. And I find myself not really sharing that perspective all of the time. I'm not completely opposed to it, but I don't know that it's always done well. And so as I was reading this, I was like, oh, this is how we really make that interesting. And I would be very interested in how other readers are responding to the way point of view is handled in this book in particular. But I also think those genre considerations do come into play as well, because like I said, at the end of the day, the narrative was a lot less propulsive than I was expecting. I don't know how to quite explain it. It felt a little hopeless at times, because it felt like it was a given that these nameless powers in the background, the people that hold the purse strings, were going to ultimately get what they wanted. And so I don't know how to sit with that, or where I'm sitting with that at this moment, because I don't know that that's necessarily wrong, unfortunately, to my current view and conception of the world. But I don't know where I wanted that to land, or how I wanted that to land. I don't know what the ultimate, or where I'm ultimately landing with the message this has, if it even has a message in relation to the individualistic versus community. And I don't know, I was expecting much more of that kind of political thriller-esque angle, a little more action, and having a literary bend inside of that action. And I don't know why we didn't have more action. We didn't really get to see Sadie doing the spying a whole lot. A lot of it felt kind of like in retrospect. We flashed back to her, targeting the guy she's dating for his access to the job, even as he is completely unaware of what is going on and is an off-page presence for most of the book. But I don't know. And maybe that's the commentary too, that a lot of this espionage is a lot more boring than we have been presented or tend to think about it, because I think that action is comforting in some way. And I don't know that this book was interested in my comfort as a reader by any means. And I don't think that that is necessary by any means. But I don't know, I guess, if all of the breaks of the emails ultimately served the story for me. And I understand, I think, the balance it was playing with, and it was another perspective within the narrative that was being offered. But I don't know how those emails were changing my conception of the world, my conception of Sadie, and the action ultimately. I don't know that they ultimately contributed or commented on the action in a way that I found meaningful, and they slowed the pace of things way down, because like I said, it was about halfway through the book, to my recollection, before we even really got into the meat and potatoes of her infiltrating this group that I thought was going to be the central focus of the book. And so I don't think that is the central focus at the end of the day, but I'm not completely sure where I land on it. And I also don't really know where I've landed with the ending. I don't know what I'm taking away from it. I don't know what I ultimately think about the mechanics of it, I guess. I'm just not really sure, and I don't know. I know that the emails and the philosophizing was supposed to lead to emotional revelations for our protagonist, whose head we were in, that got her to the end of this book, but I ultimately don't know if I see the journey for that. And her point of view may be part of the barrier in terms of getting there for me as a reader, because I don't think she's ultimately always being honest in her narration, even with herself. So that is part of the puzzle. And again, I think that that is the more interesting part, but how does that then inhibit some of the other parts of the narrative? And so that's where I fell on it, I guess. An interesting concept and an interesting point of view that I ultimately felt didn't offer anything particularly interesting to say to me in particular. And again, it's all subjective as always. So if you read this, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts. But in terms of the mechanics of it, I guess I do kind of understand why it was longlisted and not shortlisted. And I do understand that those risks, those narrative risks it took, did warrant, some kind of accolade. But from a general reading perspective, I don't know. So I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that, both in relation to it as a narrative, if you've read this, and how you felt it succeeded or didn't succeed as a reader, as well as what you think of those narrative risks. Do you think it should have ended up on the Booker shortlist? Do you think it should have been on the long list? Interested to hear your perspective as well, and am, as always, grateful that you wanted to hear my thoughts. So thank you for hanging out. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,